I'm going to be hosting and moderating our kicking off panel. That means I've got Tony Deane from AppLovin, hopefully. I've got Thomas Bidaux from ICO Partners. We've got Martine from Tamalaki. We've got Nick Murray from Game Consulting. Liz from AdColony. I think that's everybody. Such a huge list of people. But don't worry, we've got lots to talk about. Let's start off. Just explaining what we're going to talk about. So my crazy title today was have we reached the end of innovation with hybrid monetization? So with an attempt to get you guys to explain what I was thinking about, Tony, do you want to tell us who you are, what you guys are up to, and where you look at how you look at monetization in games?
Sure. Well, thank you very much for having us. Well, first of all, great to be here. So I'm Tony Deane. I head up business development for AppLovin in Nordics, Israel, and Southeast Asia. AppLovin is a global technology platform that works with 90% of the top developers in the world. We provide an integrated suite of solutions that helps game developers monetize, analyze, and grow their mobile games.
Cool. Liz, do you want to tell us about yourself and what you guys do?
Yeah, so I'm the publishing lead at AdColony for partnerships within North America and Europe. And so we're responsible for supporting the existing publishers on our network with building strategic plans for optimization, in addition to bringing on new publishers that are seeking monetization.
Cool. When you say publishers, because I know that I get confused over this, even though I know I shouldn't because I've been doing ads for too many years. So when you say publisher and when you say, it's really the supply-demand question. If anyone's in the room who don't understand the difference between supply and demand, from your guys, and I imagine from AppLovin's perspective as well, how do you define supply and demand?
So for supply, it's publishers, as we call anybody who owns an app. So anybody who's looking for demand or campaigns from brand or UA campaigns to be served into their games or into their apps. So app developers, anybody who's got an app in the App Store.
Exactly. So that's kind of a really key thing to sort of bear in mind with this thing when we're talking about the ad funding kind of model of things. Nick, do you want to explain who you are, what you do, please?
Sure thing. So, hey, I'm Nick. I run gamesconsulting.net. So that's a bespoke consulting company focused on improving products and generally improving game KPIs around retention and revenue. I also have a secondary role, which is I'm head of games for Carry First, the largest publisher in Africa.
Great. Thank you very much. And Thomas. Oh, you're on mute, Tom.
Hello, I'm Thomas Bidaux. I run a company called ICO Partners. We do a number of things, but in the context of that discussion, we work a lot with studios and publishers in the publishing a game definition of publishers. Optimize their revenue, work on their strategic development. We do work across different platforms like PC, console, and mobile, depending on the type of games they're working on, and we're looking at a business model across these different platforms as well. So help people make more revenue, basically. Always
an important thing, I'm told. Martine, obviously, actually, I don't say obviously. I know what you do, but maybe there are some people in the room who don't. Where have they been, if that's the case? But could you explain who you are and what you do, please?
Yeah, of course. I'm Martine Spaans, and I'm a publisher, a game publisher, but actually also a publisher in the sense that AdColony looks at it, because we also monetize our games by showing advertising in them. And the type of games that we focus on are mainly casual games, so it's like hidden objects, match 3, time management, puzzle games, and been doing that for about 8 years.
So let's try and work out what we mean by hybrid monetization in a bit more detail. For me, it's not just a case of either choosing between like ads or in-app purchases or even subscription or pay upfront paywalls. I think that for me, monetization is a spectrum, and finding the right balance can be a factor that is about the design of your game, but also about the life cycle of your players. So Tony, starting with you. From your side, you obviously, well, I say obviously, my feeling is your focus is mostly on the kind of ad monetization side of that, but within that there are various formats and processes that go with that. Do you have any kind of particular kind of ways that you would describe what, the role of hybrid monetization and where your teams, worked with developers?
Yeah, sure. So I think really hybrid monetization is about really growing the segment of users that you are monetizing in your game, and really working to almost extend their life cycle, but also grow your overall LTV as well.
Yeah.
So I think like there's an even more diverse real range of mobile gamers now today than there ever was, and they want to engage with games and be monetized, let's say, in even more varying ways. So hybrid monetization really allows you to do that. Really. We personally, I suppose, work with publishers or game developers by helping them really maximize how they're monetizing and how they're working with all of the different ad partners, and helping them leverage analytics to grow their LTVs even further and make sure that they're monetizing and integrating ads in the best way possible.
Actually, I think that's an important thing we should dive into a little bit, because I think that structurally is an interesting thing. So when I was the Unity guy talking about ads back in the day, we were really focused on rewarded ads, and I think there are good reasons for that. But what I think we learned from looking at rewarded ads is the placement and the nature of the ad cast the shadow on the experience. Not a shadow, the wrong word. It definitely has an impact, and there are positive vectors and more negative vectors. So placement and timing and value, for me, really matter, even with ads. Is that something you would back up?
No, totally. I think like a rewarded video, the placement itself can do a lot of different jobs depending on where it's actually inserted, right? You see lots of idle games that use them as a retention mechanism, particularly when people are returning good. If they're placed inside of the store, they can also help draw players towards the store, or they can also be used to encourage in-app purchases. Interstitials as well in some ways, whether if you place them after a loss and how you decide to frequency cap them can either serve to extend a negative experience, or if they're placed after a win, let's say, in a game, they can not as negatively impact the retention of those players. So it's in like placement, positioning, and understanding how each of your ad placements are performing is incredibly important.
So let's take that a bit further. So Liz, I mean, obviously I'd like to know what you think in terms of how you look at hybrid monetization, but I'd also like to explore a little bit of that angle we were talking about with Tony there, this idea of that placement of an ad and the purpose of an ad. And one of the things in my mind, particularly the phenomenon of hyper-casual versus the way, for example, interstitials are used in other non-hyper-casual games. For me, a hyper-casual game can afford to have more throughput of ads than maybe some other games can, because the placement of a video ad, particular video ad, provides a sense of relief, a relaxation period between the intensity of play and the kind of next time round, having a gap essentially provided by the nature of the ad. So does that make sense to you? Is that something you've witnessed? Do you think there's lessons in that for hybrid monetization in general?
No, I think I agree. I think, it's, we always try to work with the publishers or game developers and trying to find the best placements and playing the game ourselves and becoming an actual user so that we can provide the right, strategic plan around where a certain type of ads, specifically rewarded video, should be placed within the game. And then we try to, one of our big things is we like to test with our app developers and try to encourage them to be willing to, test different placements across the game. We find it's very important not only for IAP, but also to balance out between some of the users that choose to not have in-app purchases. And so we have found that our rewarded video, our Aurora video, has had amazing high engagement rates and app install rates as well. And that's where we work closely with our publishers to ensure that we're connected and where we think those ads should be placed.
And I think it's important as well to think about kind of the content of the ad, and one of the things I think the ad providers do a lot of work on, although it's more difficult nowadays with the issues around IDFA and all that kind of stuff coming up, and privacy, but the learning algorithms to make sure that we provide deeper insight so that we can give players something that they're more interested in. Is that still something that you guys are focusing on, or is it more a case of just getting the timing right inside the game itself?
I think it's both. I think especially with this new Apple, release, and we're always testing and shifting our business to ensure that, we continue to gather the appropriate data, especially with users now being a little bit more educated in what they're actually opting into. We at AdColony have really shifted the business to ensure that not only are we supporting the users, but also our advertisers.
Yeah, and that transparency, kind of anti-fraud, and all of the other sort of aspects which are so important to making sure that we're basically making the best value for the game experience. Generally, things are more. So, Nick, I've focused a lot with these guys in terms of the ad side of the business, the ad side of the monetization path. You've obviously been involved in running economies of games in various ways. Do you think that is there something in this idea of ads form a part of a journey in monetization for a player, or are they just a discrete factor to identify specific audiences who might otherwise not monetize?
I mean, I think the question of audience is definitely an important one. So if you are targeting more casual players who are used to games of a certain genre, then they're going to have certain expectations about what you offer them. And that can include the way that they can receive bonuses through ads. I mean, yeah, I kind of get the feeling that I'm here as like the IAP guy, because that's a lot of what I focus on. And that said,
I didn't say that.
yeah. That said, like I do see the value of ads. I think they can perform a lot of really good functions. As Tony mentioned earlier, they can perform retention functions for certain games. You can also give players a preview of what it's like to get a kind of booster that you would otherwise be getting as a spender. Like that's a really, really great thing to be able to do. I think my one kind of word of warning about when you're designing like a hybrid monetization economy is just all about value. There are so many games that I look at or review for people, and they're wondering why IAP revenue just isn't functioning. And a lot of the time it's because they're just totally giving away like great things through ads, which otherwise have a much higher inherent value in IAPs. So I think they can definitely work together. And I think that's the best model, because that way you're hitting people who are prepared to spend, and obviously those that don't want to but are prepared to watch ads. But it has to be done with a lot of caution and a lot of testing up front, really, to understand your economy values.
I was just going to say the E word there, I think is kind of key to, I think, really understanding kind of value proposition that the ad delivers versus the game. You reminded me actually, I think one of my favourite ones was related to Tony's point about retention, when we had Best Fiends using Unity ads back in the early days. I don't know, I'm not paid by them anymore. Why am I still promoting it? It's just because it was a good story. Sure. We had like a 2.5-fold increase in retention, sure, but it was the 3.5 times the session length that was the really fascinating one. I think that's the really kind of the thing that really turned on the light bulbs in my mind about the role of ads. But I think your point as well, Nick, is if you give away too much value, we found if you gave away more than 2 cents of value in an ad, you often break the IAP economy. Now, that's a rule of thumb, but I mean, Thomas, I think you're more on the IAP side of things, aren't you, generally? Or remind me, I can't remember the kind of you were with.
That'd be fair. That'd be fair.
Yeah.
So the way we look at the economy, because that's the notion we need to look into here. I used to have that breakdown where I have the paid bucket, the free bucket, and then I had what I call the third bucket. Well, the third bucket had lots of things in it. It could be rewarding players for tying their Facebook account, providing emails, doing certain actions, doing some promotions, things like that. And the reason I was using that that bucket analogy is because working with designers, you see they think economy, hard currency, paid and free, and then anything outside of that they didn't necessarily scoped out. And that third bucket can be pretty big, and that's where I put a lot of things for ads, because if you just use your paid bucket to feed into the ads, you end into the situation you've been describing, which is breaking your IAP economy and breaking that model. Whereas if you consider ads as its own bespoke systems inside the economy, then you can ring fence it to make it not too generous on one side. And it's tricky because you want to be a little bit generous, but maybe we don't to gatekeep the frequency at which you have those very like one-time generous ads, and then like a diminishing return onto what you can get from them, you know, with these sort of systems. And having that kind of like mentality about you need to have elements in your game design, in your economy, that's ring-fenced to be able to do these sort of things is quite important. And when you have that kind of like mentality, then it becomes easier to basically move things around, understand what's the value that's perceived by the user, because it's also another big important thing is what you as a designer consider is high value is not necessarily what is the reality when you start to launch into the wild, and people actually value certain elements of the game a lot more than you expected. And so you need to shift things around in terms of where they sit in terms of your monetization mechanisms.
I mean, it's something I spend a lot of time thinking of. I've actually moved away from the three buckets kind of model, like in the way you describe. Instead, I'm looking at exchange as a spectrum. You know, when you're moving from time, you know, to in-game currency, which is arguably a form of time, to real money, and then to subscription, and looking at, you know, how ads fits into that flow as well. You know, looking at sort of exchange, I think, is a really interesting thing. Particularly, I think, going back to Nick's point about understanding what people actually want and worry, you know, what makes it meaningful to them. And I think, you know, from Martine, from your point of view, I mean, I think a lot of your games are you know, really seem to focus, to me anyway, on understanding the audience and their untapped needs that other games don't seem to try to tap into, and try to make those free-to-play elements meaningful. Is that right? I mean, how would you look at this approach?
Yeah, well, that's always been kind of a point that, yeah, it's very important for us, you know, in all of our existence of our company. So yeah, definitely. And I think we've also, with that, sort of grown with the needs of our audience, where we typically cater to very much non-spenders, people who are, you know, kind of laggers when it comes to the adaptation of like new media. So when we start the company, we actually only monetize by ads, you know, just like very simple interstitials. And we've kind of gradually grown more with also what the audience is, you know, used to, what they were ready for. So meaning that, you know, our first in-app purchase was simply like, you know, switch off all the ads. You know, it was very basic back then. And then kind of more growing, of course, towards offering, you know, the typical in-app purchase to like more complicated packs, even to integrating subscriptions. But all the while, you know, our biggest success in terms of monetization was still from implementing rewarded videos. Not only in terms of the sort of actual revenue from the rewarded videos, but also to sort of help our customer base with conditioning to spending in the game. If you get them like a bunch of free gems with through the rewarded videos, then they get, you know, more sort of acquainted with the use of gems, and then when they see that special, you know, Christmas offer or something that's coming up, then they might actually be persuaded to make their first purchase.
I think it's an important point you're making there, because what you're basically saying to me anyway, I mean, it's not a cynical process. This is a communication process, and you're able to give them something of value, to define what value is by creating this asset, this experience that is tied into something that they know is commercial. Is that
right?
Fair side?
Yeah, exactly. You know, like you say, often there's kind of a cynical view of it, like, you know, squeezing money out of whales, and you know, there's kind of sort of terminology. But the way I kind of like to look at it, it's just like you're saying, exchange of value, and it's our job to make that value offer as interesting and as good as possible to the players, so they really look at it like, yes, this is worth, you know, a few bucks. And if not, then it's totally fine, and they can still continue to play and enjoy the game without that. But yeah, if they do, then of course that's a great compliment to us.
And I can't wait to see what your equivalent of Battle Pass will look like. Because I bet you there is one. I bet you there is something which is about that kind of VIP, engaged, increased reward.
We have done sort of a subscription model
Yeah.
where, it was, of course, like, all interstitials are switched off. With the daily login, you get like a sort of a bonus gem pack, like sort of a daily surprise. And like, we had some exclusive furniture for those people. We discontinued it because there were not so many people actually doing it. I mean, the typical conversion rate in a casual game is about 1%. So the conversion rate to actually a subscription was, as you can imagine, a lot less. But it was definitely interesting to see that there is sort of this, this core of players who are like so much into the game that they definitely see that as a meaningful value exchange.
And I think that's actually an interesting kind of thing to sort of pursue. I mean, I wasn't going to cover it yet. Maybe I'll come back to this later. But I just as sort of a placeholder, how we define our audience and we segment our audience in monetization, I think is really an interesting thing. Now, personally, I use life stage. The life cycle. I try to identify the life stage of the player to try to identify what we offer and when, and the value proposition. Because I think there's a correlation between the kind of teaching part and the learning curve of the player versus when you super engage versus re-engage users. Tony, it's up to you if you want to go into that in more detail, but I am interested in how you would look to use segmentation in games, but otherwise we can go and carry on as planned and talk about innovation. What would you prefer to talk about?
I can talk about innovation, I suppose. I can talk a little bit about segmentation as well.
Yeah, sure. I mean, either way, you take it as you will. I'll come back to the segmentation a bit later if you want.
Cool. And I suppose on the innovation side then, from how I'm seeing like studios operation and work, I think one of the largest ones in the last couple of years on the ad monetization side anyway has been in-app bidding. What that enables like developers to do is really to maximize the yield on every single impression, but also massively reducing the operational workload. They're no longer like having to optimize hundreds of different line items and going back and forth between networks like my own and Liz's. They're able to really streamline that process. So what we're seeing is ad monetization managers now moving more in towards product roles and focusing on things like ad placements and to your point, segmentation, where they actually are working on when is best to show ads and the frequency that they show ads to users. Looking at innovative ad placements, how they're also delivering the best experience to those users depending on what stage they are in those life cycles. So at certain points, like interstitials can be the right thing to show your users, and they can really help bolster the overall LTV from non-payers, and then understanding when you're actually showing them to them and what stage they're at, similar with rewarded video as well, what kind of offers you give to them, when you might be, let's say, cannibalizing IAP rev from a user that would have already likely have made an in-app purchase, or whether it is actually just a gateway in certain situations, like Martine said, to encouraging users to make in-app purchases for the end line. So yeah, I think in-app bidding has been huge, really, and how it's changed how studios have operated. And then hybrid monetization as well from a games perspective. I think hybrid casual genre and how it's been really growing and how it's been developing in terms of innovation has brought to how games are moving from one genre to another, from either like more, let's say, hyper casual games having much more sophisticated core features and an in-game meta, to like, let's say, Ancient Battles, that is like an IO game that has moved towards
I was playing that the other day.
It's really great. It has like a really sophisticated in-game economy, that would appeal to more core players. And I think the standout, which you've all probably played as well, is Arturo, which has kind of moved the ARPG genre to a little bit more of a hyper-casualized core mechanic. I was addicted to that for years.
Yeah. Oh, there are so many examples of that. I think what's interesting, I think Nick, you wrote something about Archer as well, didn't you? I know I did. The whole process of looking at the game in terms of how they actually delivered the longer term retention cycles, but they did seem to fail somewhere around the mid game. The purpose, the value proposition of progressing seemed to diminish, and I think that was a kind of core issue. But they did an amazing job of taking what was essentially a hyper casual game and making it feel like it was something deeper and richer, and I totally agree with that. So Liz, in terms of innovation for you, I mean, is it the bidding side of things? Is it the interstitial versus playable versus rewarded ad? What are you seeing that really is kind of opening up your eyes about the possibilities for a game developer?
I think it's all those things mixed together, in addition to, just we're really interested in how users are just becoming more educated on advertisements as a whole. So I think it's not just, the type of ad, but it's also them caring all of a sudden, right? Not just about receiving the reward, so to, for an example, but also what's the content, like you had mentioned earlier, within the advertisement itself. Is it another game? Is it a brand ad? What is it that's going to provide that reward to them? And I think they care more. And so I think here at AdColony, we're finding that very interesting and working closer with the game developers to ensure that we gather that information from them that they've learned from either other ad networks and their own testing, so that we can, provide the best performance that we can, depending on all the different ad units that we offer, with session time, user engagement, retention rate, all that stuff we try to put together within our strategic plans.
And I think for me, it's about not looking at users as a whale. If you just target whales, and obviously that's not what the ad business really, for me, feels like it's about. For me, the ad business is about enabling players to engage more deeply in the game, and turning that engagement into revenue. And I think getting that mindset right, getting that placement and the types right matters. I mean, Nick, do you think that? Because I think it feels like a lot of people have traditionally been moving towards the in-app purchase as the kind of targeting the whale. But as you know, I don't like the term whale anymore. I'm trying to kill it off as a term because I think it's the wrong one. Where do you sit on terms of how this balance is between what the audience wants and the type of monetization?
I mean, as you say, like, firstly, we should try and move away from the term because it feels a little disrespectful to players who are really invested in your
It's
game.
just functionally wrong. It works for gambling because there's lots of people who spend tens of thousands of dollars to stay in Vegas until they run out of money. But that's not what I think is going on with games.
No, and I mean, I prefer to focus on IAPs, but I really do see like the value of ads being there as well. It's easier to focus on IAP as the main area because it has a greater return on investment than an ad would. Like, typically for your ads, you're looking, around maybe 1 to 2 cents, whereas like IAPs can be a lot more, and then minus the 30% of platform fees and whatever else. But I think a game that has done this really well recently, and it's interesting that Tony mentioned Archero, because for me, I feel like Mr. Autofire is like a better implemented version of ads and IAPs than Archero, primarily because if you haven't played it, it's very similar to Archero with a bit more like bullet hell feeling thrown in. But the core game is totally run based, and therefore like you get rewarded videos regularly for power-ups. So you're unlocking power-ups as you level up, and then it offers you periodically an ad for an additional power-up to add to your collection. And then the goal of each run is to kind of reach the end, unlock the next stage. So any advantage you can get is really useful. It's like a big boost to your core game experience, but it really doesn't touch the metagame very much. And since the core game is totally run-based, you're not really damaging your economy in any way either. Players are watching an ad, and then the effect of that ad is gone within 5 minutes when you finish that run. So I think it's really, really cleverly put together. And, it feeds very lightly into the metagame and your overall progress, but without damaging the IAP economy that sits behind it, which obviously helps you also progress like further and better through runs.
I still want to go into more detail on that because I'm doing a masterclass on game design, monetization design, sorry, in December. So there's a whole bunch of areas I'm going into on this, like understanding what utility looks like and how you devise the forms of utility from consumables to generators and all this other stuff. But that's not for today. I'm going to try and hold back on that. But it does seem to me. Sorry.
Nice plug, though.
I'm going to plug it. Hey, any opportunity. But I think the crux here, though, I think what you're saying to me at least is finding the right balance, finding where, for example, ads are like a consumable in that context you described. You use it, it's gone, it has its effect, it's meaningful during that period of time, but then it doesn't cause the game to reset. It doesn't ratchet the game forward. Is that essentially what you're saying?
Exactly. And I mean, there are certain game types which lend themselves more to this. And I mean, if you haven't played like Mr. Autofire or even Archero, if you imagine something like Hades, recent huge PC success, imagine if that were free to play and had ads in the middle of each run. You would definitely watch them because you're already invested in that run. And then again, the effect is gone, no damage to the economy. It's kind of a win-win.
I always try to work out how much I would have spent or watched ads had that been an option in Dark Souls. Anyway, enough of that. Thomas, so again, from your point of view, this kind of balancing act of experience and value, whether it's ad or how does this work for you? What innovations really stand out that show just what you can do with this way of thinking?
I'll cheat and just bounce back on what Nick said, basically. I think what's interesting when the two examples describe Archero and Mr. Autofire is that Archero was probably designed from the ground up as an in-app purchase experience, and then the monetization on ads was grafted onto it. It's like, where can we put the ads afterward? Whereas Mr. Autofire sounds like something like from the ground, from the very beginning. It's just like, what can we do for ads that makes them meaningful but not ruin our meta game? And I think that's where the innovation is. It's kind of like when to the questions, right? Where's the innovation? The innovation is standing on the shoulders of giants, right? It's like iterative. One game does something very well, the next game does it very well as well, but add something that's a bit more natural into the system, and that's how it grows and evolve. And there's a bit of a boiling frog effect. If you ask people, has there been any innovation lately in game design and stuff like that, maybe they'll say no, because these innovations have happened throughout the life cycle of game development, which takes a while, and over many months and years. And I find that fascinating to basically travel back in time, look at games how they were like 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and how much games are now, and all the lessons that have been learned and absorbed. And I think there's much better understanding now of the mix of monetization you can use. You don't have to, because depending on your game, and how they work better, and the identity of each monetization path, basically, and what are they best used for, basically.
No, completely understand. Yeah, absolutely. Getting that right balance and that timing right. Martine, what innovations have you seen? Have you seen any new formats or new kind of mechanisms? Have you taken any lessons from other platforms? I mean, we talked about Battle Pass, arguably that's come from PC. What other things have really, do you think, have shaken up the way you think about making money from your game?
Well, nothing like really big, shocking, and spectacular. But it's all about small tweaks, basically. So we also always try to look outside of gaming to basically look at other areas of commerce and see what we can learn from them. So that's also, for example, how we came up with a prestige points system that we've implemented in the game, where people will have sort of a cashback reward to any in purchases that they've done, or any other sort of ways that they've shown really sort of a commitment to the game. Perhaps by watching more rewarded videos about reaching a certain level in the game. And, kind of also hooking a little bit of value into that. And of course, feeding back, some free things to them that, again, could show them, to teach them a little bit more about the value of the in-app purchase offers that we have. And this is really, not really anything new in other, sort of in other sort of commercial areas. Basically any American supermarket does it. But it is interesting to see like what kind of value that can bring to the people in the game. So yeah, that's why we've implemented a similar system. Like again, no shocking results, but the people who were already in the game, they appreciate it because again, it's something extra.
Yeah, I think it's always an interesting kind of balance to try and work out, where is the value for as perceived by the player, but where is the piece that will make them want to spend money, and what is the shadow that's cast by them either spending money or watching ads or whatever it is that you're using for exchange. I think those kind of balance points are always really interesting and tricky to get. And I think it's also about the nature of the game expectations. So, in terms of looking at, say, hyper casual at one end or a kind of full-on living game at the other, are there any particular lessons to learn? For example, could we take that high frequency of ads that works in hyper casual and make it work in a game as a service? And vice versa, could you take the kind of long-term retention-based value proposition that you have in a game as a service and find some way to apply that to other games? Or is it just that they're simply too different? Tony, do you have any views on any of those things?
Yeah. So, yeah, I definitely think that hyper casual has shown us that there's a really large segment of players, mobile gamers that have a really high acceptance of that.
Yeah.
I think that, players now understand more than ever as well that it's through advertisements that a lot of game developers get to keep making the games that they like. The low retention on, let's say, hyper casual games, I think is also much more of a function of the simple snackable nature of the games themselves than being solely related to ads. Although if it's going to be in the nature of any business model that helps players find different other games they would like to play, that is going to have an impact on retention. So I think there's definitely a lot that can be learned there, particularly with what we're seeing now is that games that have much longer term retention, the tools that are available now in terms of, let's say, being able to A/B test and understand frequency capping, the granular impression level data that can show you the eCPM degradation on a user over time. We're really digging into this data that hyper casual games started to look at as well, to really understand how they can maximize their monetization while tweaking up the ads and then also still providing a great experience. So yeah, there's definitely lots of lessons that can be learned, and I think that mobile game developers are already starting to do that, and we're seeing it in even these longer term retention games now.
That makes sense. So Liz, from your point of view, what do you think about this kind of balance and the lessons learned? What do you think?
I think we can learn from the hyper casual data that we've gathered, at least within this year. I think it can be a little bit difficult to take, let's say, an advertisement that's in a non-hyper casual game and put it into a hyper casual game. I think that's a little bit more of a challenge versus the other way around. But I think we're constantly trying to test and learn. Is it possible to, have the same type of retention for a hyper casual user versus a non-hyper casual user? I think it's something that we're just keep on going. I do think it's difficult though to take an ad from a non-hyper casual and put it into a hyper casual game and expect the same.
To me, the lesson is, I suppose Tony's covered some of this already, but to me the lesson is really about thinking about the placement of the ad in terms of the threshold, and that thing you get, that kind of relief factor, I think, is the key one. But I think it's interesting that it does show that the threshold that you have expected for ads may not be as high as you think. It may not be as problematic to have more ads in. What really matters is what the value is.
Right.
And I think this is the lesson generally for all monetization, which is if you don't understand what the value is to the player, I think you're stuffed. In fact, one example I had, I was helping with a game. In fact, I couldn't manage to fix it but we just couldn't work out what was going on because we had a very nice football shooting game. It played very well, but it turned out there wasn't enough of a stake. So because they didn't have the kind of, you put in 100 coins, if you win you get 200 coins back, if you lose your 100 coins, because we didn't have that type of model in there wasn't enough reason to be bothered to upgrade things. So if you couldn't be bothered to upgrade things, there was no value in the rewards you were getting for playing, and therefore there was no value in spending money in the game. But we didn't work that out until too late. And I think that's really fundamentally, for me, the kicker. I mean, Nick, have you had experiences like that, that understanding the value to the player is overriding? Or do you think I've missed something?
No, like value to the player is key, and it's so influenced by a bunch of different things, some of which you won't even have control over. Like, you know, you have to consider things like item saturation. Is there a ton of this particular booster already in the economy or on people's accounts? Like, how does it look visually? Sometimes, you know, for cosmetic items, then you need to consider, like, actually a lot of value comes from just the aesthetics of the thing. So I think, you know, understanding value is a really tricky proposition. And then, like, actually leveraging that value to its best extent is really like one of the keys of making a successful IAP driven game. I'd say, like, just to come back briefly to the idea about like learning from hyper casual, I think you're also right that there probably is more tolerance for a higher level of ads than people, including myself, would have previously thought. But I think the key is that if you were going to try and have like heavily ad driven games for like, or heavy number of ads in an IAP driven game, you would need to have this value proposition clearly in place, and you'd need to also make sure that the core game and the flow and the fun aspects of the gameplay are also not going to be reduced as a result.
So with that in mind, I think it'd be interesting sort of just, again, because we're running out of time as well, I just in the back of my mind is just a real question. The elephant in the room, obviously, you know, the IDFA and the however you pronounce it, SCAN network or SCAD network, or however you want to talk about that kind of like alternatives. Is this balancing act between in-app purchase and hybrid? Is this kind of integration of these two ways of thinking going to change? Is the balance going to shift? Or are we really talking about just finding different ways to recreate business as usual? I mean, Thomas, do you have any views on that?
We are very adaptable, so I think whatever happens, we'll find a way to go back to either different way to optimize or just adapt to the new framework. So I'm not sure it's going to change in the long term in terms of the balance of things.
Do you think it might trigger some different innovation? I mean, like, for example, might we see we're getting more brand or maybe less brand? And might we see the mix of like, audio versus in-world ads versus... So
I think this would happen regardless, right? And this might accelerate the need to look at different opportunities. But these things would happen regardless, I think, because there's always an appetite for new integrations and new approaches that you will see. And sometimes it's driven by either very niche games that have very specific needs that can't fit into the usual models, or like very big brands trying to break out and can do things at a scale that others can't do, and thus, you know, not be bound by the same rules of physics as the smaller developers. But once the way is showed, then it opens up for many variations, many new angles for that. So I expect that to happen.
Absolutely. So, Martine, how do you feel about that? I mean, in terms of, is it, as Thomas says, we're just going to innovate and make do and make it all work, or do you think that there's some troubles on the route?
Yeah, no, I definitely could agree with that. It's just basically find a solution for it. patch that up, make it work, and continue. There's been countless of hurdles kind of thrown at the mobile game publishing space, and every time it's like, sort of first overcome and innovate later, as kind of a survival strategy, because that's why I also think that'll kind of be the way to go now.
Makes sense. So, Tony, I mean, yourself, I mean, obviously, I'm assuming that you've got yourselves all organised when it comes to this, but probably you've been doing this for, knowing what you're going to do for a while yet. I imagine Liz as well. Do you guys have any kind of advice for people in this changeover time?
Yeah, well, I think it's still a little bit of flux until we really understand what is going to happen and what Apple's going to come out with, right? I think the things that from an advertising perspective, developers should be doing is thinking about the types of opt-in flow that they're going to have in order to maximize engagement there, and making sure that they have a BI, let's say, that is their users are tied around IDFB or some sort of internal user ID. And from it, so that they can really track their users and really understand them. And then from a UI perspective, I think it comes down to understanding what is the minimal viable products that you need to run successful UI campaigns, and making sure that you have that in place so that you're ready for when the things comes anyway, and you're able to really deal with the hurdles that are going to be ahead of you as much as possible.
I mean, do you think that there'd be particular implications, for example, for like early stage monetization, like day 1 to 3? There's a question that came up about that. Do you think that there's going to be a particular issue around that?
So I think if we're talking about like SK Ad Network, I think that we'd have to wait and see what the new product is going to be like. Whether or not we are still going to be left with these products that are rolling and it's type app. So at this point, I wouldn't want to get into it really.
No, don't blame me, but I have to ask.
Feel like I'm following people down the wrong path or something. So
exactly. And Liz, do you have a similar view on this, or?
Yeah, we've adapted pretty quickly at AdColony to support, the SCAD network infrastructure and supporting scan IDs and things like that. I think there's two main things that publishers, I think, need to think about. Is that one is consent messaging. What type of messaging can you provide to your users to get them to opt in versus to opting out? And I think this is a good time to test that out, at least, with other ad networks, and gather as much data as you can before they enforce that. And in addition to that is supporting, all the DSPs that had to produce these scan IDs and implementing them within the SDK of your ad networks into your app. And I think, once you start to minimize the SDK, the DSPs that you want to support or allow or get approved to serve the demand into your supply, is going to decrease the revenue that you're seeing today, for example. So I think those are the two main things that we at AdColony like to emphasize when we talk to gaming developers is, don't forget, there's work that needs to be done. It's not just an advertiser on the UA side that's being infected here, but it's also on the app developers as well.
Absolutely makes sense to me. I think this is kind of being prepared, understand the consequences are going to be really important. I think the biggest challenge in some ways is for games teams that are about to launch, because you've got so much else to worry about. To have to worry about getting yourself ready for this as well is problematic. Good job I haven't got 3 games I'm currently testing. Anyway, enough of that. So, look, I've just run out of time to ask you what you think about the Apple tax. Oh, wait, no, that wasn't deliberate at all. Because we don't want to get into that conversation. That's far too dangerous. So on that note, I'm going to say thank you very much to my panel, and it was great stuff. Thank you all. And obviously we have to specifically thank AdColony because they are sponsoring this track. In fact, I think we've got a brief message coming up from AdColony. It doesn't have audio, don't worry. So if you hear silence, don't worry, it's intentional. So I think we'll run the VT on that, please. That's great stuff. So again, like I say, thanks to our track sponsor of AdColony.